Hey guys, Joe here, back to the Word today with a book review and chapter summaries of this work right here on the Christian Life by John Calvin, a new translation recently published by Crossway Books, a foretaste of their coming full translation of Calvin's Institutes. It's going to be coming out in the future, which is going to be a new translation in English. And this translation, as well as the one in the future coming out by Crossway, is done by Raymond A. Blackadder. The editor is Anthony N.S. Lane. And then the consultation for the classicist parts is Kirk M. Summers. I've been super excited about not only this volume as a foretaste of that new translation, but the full translation. I'm going to be doing a video real soon on my channel. I'll link to it in the description on why a new translation of Calvin's Institutes in English is needed for the 21st century. So I'll put the card up once the video's up real soon and put the comment or the link in the description below for you guys. This video is going to be timestamped, so feel free to hop ahead to the section that most interests you, be it the book review part or my chapter summaries. I'm also going to be putting those summaries up on my blog, and I'll leave that link in the description for you guys as well. This is Back to the Word. My channel exists to equip and encourage you to read the Bible, good books, and have conversations that truly matter. If you're down for that sort of content, want to promote it, encourage it, hit the like button. Also hit subscribe and notification bell so you don't miss a future video when I release them. So let's go ahead and get into the book review portion of this new translation. So first up, who is this for? Any Christian can read this book. It's only 96 or so pages. It's Calvin on the Christian life. Super practical, super well done. But it's going to mostly appeal to those who want to get introduced to Calvin or start reading Calvin, because it's one of his most practical readings on living the Christian life. He actually, when he added this content to the Institutes, was pretty quick to pull it out and publish it on its own as well, so people get access to this content. Also, who wrote it? I've already mentioned it. John Calvin. He lived from 1509 to 1564, and he was one of the most influential theologians of the Reformation. So he was known best for his Institutes on the Christian religion. He also wrote landmark expositions, or more known as his commentaries, on most of the books of the Bible. So we talk about this book as well as this translation from Crossway, beautifully published. What stands out? First, it's a great starter read for those getting into Calvin. Obviously, you're reading someone from the 1500s. There's a little bit of a barrier there. It's not what we're used to reading, but there's great content in here, super biblical content. I've read this a couple times in English. I read the Ligonier translation a couple years ago that came out in 2017. I've read this, and I'm just so impressed, and I learn something every time I read it. It's also short. This volume is 96 pages or so, and it's a very well done translation. Something I'm excited about. Check out my longer video on why this new translation is needed. I'll get into the translation features, but there are excellent footnotes. They've done a great job with the headings. Calvin did not have headings in the Institutes or his other works, and so we add those as modern readers. So they've done a great job trying to add accurate headings, as well as good translation notes on different language things, different versions of the Institutes, and those sorts of things in this translation. So I'm very excited about those features. Also, I just want to talk about that the content for this book, John Calvin on the Christian Life, was pulled from his Institutes. He added these chapters to his Institutes, and then shortly after that said these chapters should also be their standalone work on the Christian life. Calvin's the one who made that decision, and then it's been translated multiple times into English at different points. And so this content actually comes from Book 3 of the Institutes, chapters 6 through 10. And so they were pulled out by Calvin himself. They're really summaries and abridgments of those larger chapters. And I'm so glad that we have these types of chapters for Calvin on their own for us to read. I also love that in this translation, I mentioned I've already read the Ligonier one, the translation that was done in 2017 in English. they kept the chapter numbers from the Institutes. Sometimes you don't notice that, and you kind of don't know that it's actually pulled and abridged from chapters in the Institutes, but they make that very clear. They talk about the title of book 3 and the subject. We'll get into it in the summary points when I get there, but they keep like the book 3 part, what the section is titled, and the chapter numbers actually match what's in the Institutes. And I think that's a great enhancement of this new translation. And lastly, the book is beautifully published by Crossway. Crossway does an amazing job. I'm just increasingly more thankful for the great way they publish amazing Christian books. So, time right there for the book review portion. So I'm going to summarize my thoughts right there and just leave it there. More from me to come on this new translation in that bigger video, which I'll link in the description once it comes out. But now I want to go through and just give you guys a short summary of each chapter in this book, Calvin on the Christian Life, to kind of help you, if you get this, to read through it, and to help those who may not be getting this to actually get some of the content and to think about some of the things John Calvin thinks were really important for us as Christians to live out practically in the Christian life. So my notes are going to be running along the side for you guys to follow along. The content for this book talks about the editor's introduction. He talks about the work, where it came from, the history of publication. Then you get into abbreviations used in the work. And then you have book 3, How We Obtain the Grace of Christ. So this is book 3 of Calvin's Institutes. These chapters are located in on how we obtain the grace of Christ. Then the section specifically is the benefits that come to us and the fruits that follow from that grace. And then we get to chapter 6. So the numbering follows the Institute's placing. I'm so glad they did this. Very thankful. The life of a Christian. And so it says, first, the arguments that Scripture uses to encourage us to that life. And so here's my short little kind of sentence summary. It says, this chapter covers general principles for the Christian life and the factors that should motivate us to pursue it. So he goes through multiple principles, kind of first things, order of things that we should think about as we are pursuing the Christian life as Christians. So here's a summary. It says we should order our lives from the Scriptures. It says we are called to love and pursue holiness because God is holy. The holiness of Christ is our pattern to pursue, and there's whole paragraphs on these things. The gospel is a doctrine of mind, intellect, word, and deed. Put the emphasis there on deed. It's not just to remain in our mind and to remain in our heart, but to be lived out in our life. And then he says, and the mark of a Christian is not perfection, but single-minded progress toward it. So those are some of the sections and some of the content in that chapter 6, the life of a Christian. Chapter 7, the sum of the Christian life, in which we discuss the denial of ourselves. So chapters 6 and 7 are jointly framed around Jesus's statement. Following him involves denying oneself and taking up one's cross from Matthew 16:24, which is something I think is really cool that Calvin would structure 2 sections or 2 chapters from this statement from Jesus. So in this chapter 7, focuses on the need of self-denial, saying no to oneself and yes to submission to God. So what are some of the things he talks about around that theme in this chapter? He talks about dedicating ourselves to God as a living sacrifice is the beginning of a new life. The next step of righteousness is to seek the things of God and pursue them for the Lord's sake and because they please him. So not to gain approval of man, not to gain better status, but we do them purely because the Lord has told us to do them, and we want him to delight in us, and we want to obey him. He says, beyond just denying self and putting God first, we also must put others before ourselves, and we should do good to them because they are made in God's image. That's a really good section in this chapter. It says we must do everything from love, depend on God's blessings, and even in life's miseries, trust God's hand in everything. Then in chapter 8, he moves to one aspect of self-denial being bearing the cross, kind of continuing that theme from Matthew 16:24, an aspect of self-denial. It says this chapter focuses on one aspect of self-denial, that of bearing the cross. otherwise known as patiently suffering whatever tribulations God may send our way on this current earthly pilgrim journey. So he talks about bearing our cross entails a difficult life as we follow the pattern of Christ. There are many things that affliction and being under a cross do and will form in our lives. So one, it shows us that we overestimate our own strength. It gives us a deeper knowledge of ourselves. It builds our confidence in God's faithfulness. It tests our patience and trains us in obedience, and it helps correct us. He then gives us this warning in the chapter: the flesh is weak, but bearing a cross for Christ is an honor and brings a reward. He also talks about bearing our cross helps us develop a patience that feels hardships, but still trusts God in the process and throughout this life. So really good chapter here. Really enjoyed reading this and kind of thinking about these aspects in my own life and some of the things I've been through that have grown these things in my life. Chapter 9, he moves to a topic of meditating on the future life. So this chapter is devoted to the theme of meditation on the future life, that we should be grateful for the good things God gives us in this life, but in comparison to the future heavenly life, that gratefulness should look like we despise or scorn our present earthly life. This is something pretty big that he's talking about here. I kind of get some hints here that there are some in his day that wanted to loathe earthly possessions in this life at all and just learn for heaven. But then there's others who just were overcorrecting all over the place. And he's like, we should enjoy God's good gifts, but in balance, know that what we're really living for is future coming in glory. And that's what the chapter talks about. He says, miseries in this life teach us not to seek our own happiness in this life. We must break free from the love of this world. We are not to despise earthly things for God and to be ungrateful, but in comparison to the life to come, it must be clear which is far greater, glorious, and precious to us. This was a really good section for me personally. I really identified this reading through with the section where he talked about how easily we can deny this life. We don't want to fall in love with this life or this world, but then our heart drifts back, and we must always remind ourselves of the future glory to come, that it's much better, that we must meditate on heaven. The chapter continues on the hope of the resurrection should conquer the fear of death for the Christian, but this is hard to maintain since we live in this world. Thus, our mind will be troubled by present circumstances until our eyes see the future day of salvation. Then we have the last chapter of this work, chapter 10, how we must use the present life and its means of support. He's really putting an argument here forward for the legitimate use of things. So this chapter is where Calvin sets out a middle way between affluent materialism and aesthetic legalism. So ultimately arguing for a legitimate use of things. The proper use of things in this life, according to Calvin, should include 1, a moderate use without enslavement, 2, a stewardship mindset concerning all earthly possessions, and 3, generosity in sharing our resources. So then I get into more of the specific headings and content of the chapter here with this other bullet point. Scripture tells us about the proper use of earthly goods. Don't be too strict or too indulgent. God created earthly goods for necessity and delight, so we can use them. Everything we receive is from God, but we must resist the temptation of lust and access. He does some really good stuff on that within this work. Thus, Christians must cultivate contempt for this life that realizes how it fails God's perfect design. So that's the contempt. Is we're thankful for God's good gifts in this life, but our contempt should be for how it fails God's good design and how it's sinful, it's distorted, and it's not the full pleasure, it's not the full revelation of good design that God has for us in the future. He says we should meditate on immortality, specifically that immortality which is to come, and so as to prevent excessive concern with external earthly matters. 2 rules follow from this balance that we should have in the Christian life. 1, live simply, use things as if you don't have them, and eliminate things that divert or hinder you from thinking about the heavenly life and your soul. The 2nd rule, endure scarcity with patience. And there is a 3rd rule from Scripture that Calvin also brings out as well, that we must remember to whom we will give an accounting for our use of earthly things, which is ultimately to God. We will give an account to him for how we use the things God has given us. And that includes our vocation, which is how he ends the chapter. He says, lastly, each one of us is directed by the Lord to consider our calling/vocation. And what we do with it will be measured with this in mind. Thus, no task, vocation/calling is so menial or insignificant that it will not be considered by God and your stewardship of it weighed. So just for us to think about, God's given each one of us a calling, each one of us a mission in life. We are responsible to him to live that out. And he's also given us a certain type of vocation, work, access, resources. And regardless of it being little or much, we will give an accounting to him of those things and how we stewarded them. So that ends this little work in my chapter summaries. As I already said, I'll put the link up in this description to my blog where you can go read those more in depth, the notes that I just shared right there. I also have the purchase link in the description for this work right here from Crossway. They're doing amazing work. I'm super excited about this new translation. They announced this new translation of Calvin Institutes by Blackadder towards the end of 2020. They've promised they're moving towards a publication date in 2025 sometime. I'm really hoping Crossway hits that deadline. I'm super excited for this new edition of the Institutes to read, but I'm very thankful for this foretaste. There's good things to come. Check out my longer video on why a new translation of Calvin's Institutes is needed. That'll be coming out soon. If you're watching this a little later, it's already linked below in the description for you guys. So until next time, continue to read, treasure, follow the word. God bless, and I'll see you guys soon.